Overlooking Scotland's most famous body of water, Loch Ness, stands the ruins of what was once a great fortress of the ancient world, Castle Urquhart. It is told that a fortification has always stood on that very point, watching over the loch and being a renowned seat of power in the highlands. The first mention of such a fort comes from 562 AD, when it was happened upon by Saint Colomba, during his mission to convert the savage Pictish tribes to Christianity. He writes that a man of much power and wealth had built for himself a fort or large household somewhere along the banks of the loch. These writings seem to be reinforced by archaeological findings which suggest the presence of a fort under what is now the southwest corner of the castle. Another suggestion is that the fort may have been home of Bridei I, king of the Picts, from 554 AD to 586. The first mention of the castle, as we now know it, was in the early 13th century, when the lands of Urquhart were granted to Thomas Durward, a ward of the then King of Scotland, Alexander II. It is believed that the castle was built by Durward and completed by his son. Although the first documented record of the castle doesn't come until 1296, when the great castle of Urquhart was captured by a man with many names in Scotland, but for the sake of monetisation, I will call him only Edward Longshanks, King of England. Urquhart was lost in the First English invasion, which marked the beginning of the Scottish Wars of Independence. The castle changed sides a few times in the following years, with various sieges and attacks by Andrew de Murray the Younger and Alexander de Forbes, before it was eventually freed from English hands in 1307, when Robert the Bruce marched through the Great Glen, taking all the castles surrounding the loch. Urquhart has always been the centre for intrigue and war, for battles and soldiers. After the Scottish Wars for Independence, the castle would change hands back and forth between the Scottish clans and the MacDonald Lords of the Isles for some 300 years. It next appears in history during the Revolution of 1688, when it was garrisoned by Ludwig Grant, an ally of William of Orange. At that point in time, the castle was under siege by a force of 500 Jacobite soldiers, and remained so until the main Jacobite force was defeated at Cromdale. Eventually, the castle would be left by the government soldiers, but on their way out they would leave explosives and destroy the castle to prevent it being occupied by the Jacobite forces. But this plan was not entirely successful, as soon 3 Jacobite soldiers would find sanctuary within the ruins of this ancient battlefield, the Fugitive Lovers. On the 16th of April, 1746, the Jacobite army, led by Charles Edward Stuart, known to many as Bonnie Prince Charlie, would be defeated in the devastating Battle of Culloden. In the aftermath, an order of no quarter was given. The government forces were to kill on sight any Jacobite sympathiser they could find. It was this that led to the overwhelming Jacobean casualties, from the murder of routing soldiers and the killing of wounded men too lame to stand or run. It is in this bloodbath we meet the characters of our story. One was a gentleman soldier of some rank and an officer within the Jacobite force. Having been wounded during the battle, he found himself fleeing the brutality of the government forces. The man would make it to Loch Ness and began making his way along the bank opposite Urquhart Castle. The officer had only made it this far due to the aid of his 2 retainers, one of whom was a fox hunter and a native to the lands of Urquhart. His knowledge of the local roads and paths were perhaps the only reason that the 3 men had escaped the battlefield alive. As they scrambled onwards down the bank, it became quite obvious that the officer's wounds were slowing him considerably, and at their current pace, any government forces would soon catch up with them. It was then that the hunter spied a small boat moored on the loch bank, and proposed that they should take the boat to the other side and hide themselves within the ruins of the old castle. Knowing his injuries were too severe to carry onwards, the officer agreed to the plan, and the three men climbed aboard the boat and set off through the loch. It took them a few hours to cross the expanse of the loch, and upon landing on the opposing shore, they heaved up the boat and hid it within the trees. The three men secured themselves in a deep hidden vault beneath the castle, which was only known to a few locals. Luckily for our band of Jacobites, the fox hunter Ewan had been just such a person. The men tended to their wounds, and within no time at all, the exhausted three fell asleep within the depths of the castle. It was near midday before any of the men awoke, and it was about this time that the third man said, "I'm glad we're safe, but a bite to eat would be a godsend." "Aye, very true," said the hunter, "and if my beautiful Mary knew aught of poor Ewan the hunter's plight, she would endeavour to aid me, even through the hail of Sassenach bullets." It was then a startled whisper arose from the officer. "By God, our hiding place is discovered. Look at the shadow about the entrance." The hunter grinned wildly, and with a deep laugh, he called out, "Oh, 'tis the shadow of a friend." In an instant, a short-legged Scottish terrier sprang into the vault. "Kraken," said the hunter, while hugging his faithful friend, "this is your kindest visit you've ever paid me." The men were overjoyed that they had not been found, and were quite happy to spend their time with the little dog. But knowing that the terrier had been let loose to find him, the hunter understood that his partner was concerned. This gave the man a cunning idea. As the sun began to fall in the sky, Ewan crept out of the vault with his little friend, and tied about the dog his garter. He then told the fearless Kraken to go home and bring back his wife and some supplies. Quickly the black dog sped off up the glen, heading straight for home. Some 4 hours later, in the darkness of night, the little dog returned to the vault, and the garter about him was gone. Ewan jumped up with great happiness, patting the dog's head, and left the vault only to return a moment later with a beautiful young woman. Covering the only entrance with an old travelling cloak and striking a light, the hunter would then introduce his betrothed, Mary MacLachlan. The woman had understood immediately upon seeing the garter that she herself had woven, that her husband was in the area, and hastened to aid him with all the provisions she could carry. But most importantly for the other two fugitives, the delightful woman had brought a small flask of fine Scottish whisky. The men's thirst and hunger were satisfied, and during that night they told the woman of all that had happened, and how the battle had been lost, and most importantly, their precarious position. The maiden told her side of the tale, the brutal efficiency of the government soldiers, how still at this very moment they were scouring the lands, hunting for the routed Jacobites. It was decided that the vault underneath the castle was the safest place to stay, and Mary would return each night to give the men food and whisky, since she could pass along the roads more freely. This plan would continue to work for some days, with the woman returning at night and leaving before daybreak, so as to hide her comings and goings in the shadow of darkness. But then on one day, young Mary did not appear, and neither did the little dog. The men were much worried by this, but hoped the woman had seen soldiers, and thought better of giving away their hiding space, and perhaps returned home. Yet when the second night came, and there was still no sign of the young woman, Ewan's fear of the government troops was quickly overcome by his concern for his betrothed. In spite of the danger currently scouring the highlands, Ewan left the vault and ventured forth to find his beloved. The night was dark, and the cold wind rattled through the silent glen, as the hunter slipped out of the ruins and headed for his home. He walked for some 2 miles, deathly afraid that the sound of each step would betray his position and lead him to certain death. Suddenly, in the distance, he heard musket fire, and with an impressive haste concealed himself within the bracken. Here the man waited with bated breath, fearing who would come down the road. After a time, he heard movement behind him, and spinning around with his sword drawn, he spotted the friendly face of his little dog. But the joy of finding him was quickly soured, as the man could see a thick cord wrapped around the animal's neck. Ewan knew that this was no work of his Mary, and a sudden horror seemed to creep over the man. What if his love was captured, and the dog was to lead the soldiers to the castle ruins? Wiping a cold sweat from his brow, Ewan was faced with a horrible decision. Warn his friends and flee, leaving Mary at the whims of the bloodthirsty soldiers, or try to save his betrothed, possibly damning his friends to a cruel death. Either way, it did not take the man long to choose, and if he was to die trying to save the one he loved, then he would face it like a true Scotsman. Cutting the cord from the dog, he ordered it to follow at his heel, and ventured forward on the road. He would eventually happen upon an old wooden barn, with light streaming from its door, and hearing voices from within, the curious huntsman slowly crept closer to see who was there. A feeling of sudden terror rushed through the Scotsman as he saw a band of government soldiers surrounding young Mary. "Come on now," called the leading officer. "That fool has let your dog escape, so now it is you who will lead us to the rebels. I am sure you prize your own safety, and will guide me to the spot," the man continued. "You shall walk with me until you point out the lurking place of these cowards." Turning to his men, the man ordered them to remain ready and wait to hear his signal whistle, at which point they should advance to it with all haste. The commander roughly pulled at Mary and headed for the barn door. Ewan, doing all in his power to restrain himself, hid by the barn side and proceeded to follow the commander and his unwilling companion. All three continued on the old road to the castle, but once the barn was out of sight, the young woman stopped in her tracks. "Keep going," shouted the officer. "I don't care 1 farthing for your life, and if you do not lead me to the rebels this instant, then this blade—" The man drew his sword and held the point against the woman. "Shall in 2 minutes enter your heart." Poor Mary trembled and shook as she told the man she would go no further. It was then the deep voice of Ewan sprang from the darkness. "Perhaps you should turn your weapon this way, brave soldier." And as the officer spun round, the hunter clubbed him hard with a large tree branch, knocking the man unconscious. As the sword and the officer fell to the ground, the young lovers were reunited in each other's arms. Mary thanked Ewan for coming to her rescue, and then asked if the officer between them was dead. But Ewan replied, "No, he lives. I would not dirty my hands in his blood, but quickly we must go." With all the speed the pair could muster, they ran to the ruined castle and warned the others. It was in this way that the fugitive lovers escaped the aftermath of Culloden, and it was with much gratitude that they looked upon the ancient castle which had given them refuge and concealed their retreat. That very night, the lovers and their 2 companions fled from the castle and found safety in the forests of Bridei, where they discovered the remnants of the Cameron forces, led by Lochiel, the clan chief. With these troops, they made their way to the coast, and the wounded officer boarded a ship bound for France. Ewan and Mary would not leave Scotland, as they had no money, high rank or status to survive penniless on the continent. So the pair would stay near the coast, and with Ewan's Jacobite colours well and truly hidden, they would settle down and start a family. It is said by many that the brave descendants of Ewan and Mary can still be found in Loch to this very day. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons who help me keep these tales alive. It would seem that Urquhart Castle has been the central point in many tales of woe and love. One story concerns the famous Gaelic poet Donald Donn, who for many years was held in the deep dark prison cells within the castle. Officially, he was charged with the theft of cattle, which was a common occurrence at the time. As the MacDonalds of the Isles and Clan Grant, the holders of Urquhart, had been at war with each other for many years, both of them owning the castle at different points throughout history, so it was safe to say there was plenty bad blood. It may have been this very feud that led to the local legend of Donald's true crime. It was said that Donald Donn, the warrior poet, had fallen in love with the daughter of Clan Grant's chief. Donald knew that the Grant men were hunting him and ordered to find him and capture him, but he refused to leave the one he loved, and was eventually captured and taken to the castle in heavy chains. While the bard was imprisoned, he continued composing songs and ballads of his tragic life and his lost love, hoping that perhaps one day the words would fall upon a sympathetic ear and lead to his rescue. But unfortunately for the captive poet, there was to be no romantic escape from the cells of Urquhart Castle. And when a time eventually did arrive for him to leave his cell, it was only to reach the hangman's noose and end the local folk hero. On the history of the castle itself, many stories tell of the hidden and secret vaults that lie beneath it. It has long been a legend in the Highlands that in one of these vaults was a great treasure which had been hoarded for hundreds of years, but it would take an incredibly brave or foolish man to try and find this vault, as there was the possibility he may open the wrong door, for it was said there was another vault in which lays a horrific plague, and opening this vault would release the evil and devour Scotland. So if you ever visit the great castle of Urquhart, I would strongly advise you to stick with a tour guide. Until next time, Slàinte mhath.